In this video, I'll be talking about 5 upgrades and modifications for the table saw. My saw is the DeWalt DW745, although the same mods can be applied to some other table saws too. This is the third in a trilogy of videos that I've put out about the table saw. The first one was about cleaning and maintenance, and the second was all about how to set up your table saw for maximum accuracy. I'll leave links to those videos in the description box below if you're interested in checking them out. The first modification is a Flappy Paddle, and it's something that DeWalt really should have included on the tool originally, in my opinion. I didn't make this, it was actually sent to me as a gift by a top bloke and also a patron of the channel, Paul Taylor, and he has some available for sale on his Etsy page, so if you're interested in buying one, you'll find a link to that in the description box below. If you'd rather make one of your own, it'd be pretty simple to make one of these. It's basically a piece of wood shaped to fit inside this groove here. A hinge which is attached to this block with some bolts which go through the plastic case of the saw with nuts securing everything from the inside. The paddle itself has a block attached to it that falls in line with the stop button of the saw. So to have one of these fitted, you do need to drill a couple of holes through the plastic shell of the saw, but for me, I wasn't worried about that, and after all, it is a really important safety feature. The beauty of this is that now I no longer need to fumble around feeling for the off button when I need to stop the saw. I can just nudge it with my knee to turn it off, and there's a finger hole so you can turn it on without lifting up the paddle too. If you're making a cut and feel the wood starts to bind, or if something just doesn't feel quite right as you're making a cut, you can continue holding the workpiece down and shut off the saw really easily. I love this, and now I have it fitted, I couldn't go back to using the old switch. Secondly is a low profile riving knife. Undoubtedly the most frequently asked question that I've ever had since I started making YouTube videos about 5 years ago is, where did you get your riving knife? And that's because the original DW745 models were sold with a riving knife that was not adjustable in height, meaning that if you want to make any cuts without going all of the way through the material that you're cutting, so for example if you want to cut a rebate or a housing joint, you have to completely remove the riving knife entirely to make the cut. I believe that the newer models of this table saw might now have an adjustable height riving knife, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Perhaps someone can confirm in the comments, and it's something to check out if you're thinking of buying one of these. Now, I'm of the opinion that the riving knife is the most important safety feature on a table saw, unless you're one of those lucky saw stop owners with its flesh detecting technology, in which case that is the most important safety feature. But anyway, I did not want to keep removing my riving knife because the danger is you either forget to put it back in, or maybe you get a bit lazy and don't put it back in again, and that's a really bad idea. Originally I looked around online to see if I could buy a low profile riving knife for the saw, and I couldn't find one, so I altered the original riving knife to reshape it to be a low profile knife. Now, before I explain how I did that, it's important to point out that I need to be careful with what I say here, because there's one major safety issue with doing what I did, and that is that when you adjust the height of the riving knife, the blade guard that comes supplied with the saw will no longer fit onto it, and the blade guard is another important safety feature. So some people will want to point out now that my saw is now less safe to use, and for that reason I can't recommend doing what I did. You should always have a blade guard and a riving knife fitted to your table saw. In fact, I think it's even a legal requirement in a commercial workshop setting here in the UK to have a blade guard or crown guard, whatever you might want to call it, fitted. But for me personally, having a riving knife fitted permanently was more of a priority than having the blade guard fitted, so that's why I adjusted it. But again, I don't recommend doing this. Another option could be to buy an additional original riving knife, and then you could adjust one of the ones that you have and keep the other for use with the blade guard, depending on what cuts you want to make. But please remember that your safety is your responsibility. Do your own research on this and make sure you're working safely, and don't just trust any old idiot like me on the internet. Now I'll try explaining how I adjusted the riving knife without actually doing it, so you might have to use your imagination a bit here. With the saw unplugged and the original riving knife fitted into the saw, I used a block of wood as a spacer and adjusted the height of the blade until it was roughly level with the top of the block, and then marked up a line onto the riving knife with a Sharpie pen. I wanted the height of the riving knife to be a fraction below the height of the table saw blade. I then cut along that line with a cutting disc in my angle grinder, cutting just below the line I'd marked up to make sure it would sit lower than the height of the blade. The metal that these riving knives are made from is extremely hard, so it did take a while to cut through, and it's important to remember not to let it get too hot while you're cutting because you don't want to distort or misshape the riving knife. So it's a good idea to take a break in between cuts or perhaps cool it down with some water. Then I did more shaping of the knife at the benchtop belt sander. I then fitted the riving knife, and I also checked that it was straight and perfectly in line with the blade, because you want to make sure that there's no chance of the material that you're cutting snagging on the riving knife. It wasn't too difficult to do though, and mine's been pretty much permanently in the saw for the last 4.5 years, and it's nice not having to worry about taking it out and putting it back in again. The third modification is a zero clearance insert plate, and this was also made for me by someone else. My friend Matt over at Happy Wife Happy Life YouTube channel has a video about how he made this, which I'll link to in the description box below. This is quite simply the best insert plate I've ever used. It hooks to the underside of the saw, which is a great safety feature. The original insert plate that is supplied with the saw has this huge slot in it which allows for the blade angle to be adjusted. But that means that if you're ever cutting something at 90 degrees and the offcut of the workpiece happens to be quite thin, there's a chance that the offcut from the workpiece can fall down inside the saw, which is potentially dangerous and also very annoying, because you then have to try and get the damn thing out of a very narrow blade housing, which is never easy. The zero insert plate also makes for much cleaner table saw cuts, which means less grain tear out, and those are the two reasons why I think having a zero insert plate is really important. If you don't want to make one out of plastic like Matt did, you could also make one out of wood, and there are hundreds of good videos on YouTube about how to do that. I'll link to a couple of my favourites below. Fourth is the mitre gauge and jigs. The mitre gauge that comes with the saw doesn't fit the mitre slots properly, and that's a common problem with tools. I really don't know why. There's way too much slack in this, which makes it inaccurate and unusable in my opinion, and that's why mine has been in a drawer ever since I got the saw. What works much better is a cross-cut sled if you want to make accurate 90-degree cuts. I'll link to the video where I made this one in the description box below. There are also some videos about some much fancier cross-cut sleds than the ones that I made. Again, hundreds of videos on YouTube where you can find ones with built-in stop blocks and hold-down accessories. I don't personally have much of a need for a fancier one because I tend to make most of those kind of cuts at the mitre saw anyway. But again, I'll link to some of my favourite cross-cut sled videos in the description box below if you're interested. If you want to make different angled cuts with something adjustable, another option is to modify the mitre gauge that you got with the saw so that it fits and works properly. And I'll link to a video below by A. Souza, not sure if that's how you say his name, where he does just that and gets great results. Yet another alternative is to invest in a much better quality mitre gauge. There are some out there that look really good and they're adjustable to fit snugly into whatever mitre gauge slots you have on your saw, and I'll link to some of those in the description box too. There are a host of other jigs that you can make for the table saw too, a few of which I've made and have videos about, such as my tenon jig, a frame spline jig and a panel cutting jig. And there are probably hundreds of different other jigs you can make for your table saw, but those are the key ones that I use frequently. I also have a really simple but effective and very useful tapering jig made out of aluminium, and you can buy those on Amazon. I'll link to that in the description box below too. Finally, number 5 is a dust tray. This modification is one that I've thought about but I haven't actually made yet, mainly because I'm not sure I'm going to keep this saw in the longer run, so I don't want to build something for it and then have to build something else when I get a different saw. But I thought I'd talk you through the idea anyway. It's pretty simple. If you were to make your own stand for this saw like I did a few years ago, and there's a link to that down below too, the idea is to incorporate a shallow drawer or tray underneath the saw to catch all of the dust that falls down and sits underneath the saw so that it's much easier to clear out. If you imagine that only the 4 legs of the saw are supported by this shelf here that the saw sits on, and the rest of this material was cut away, and then underneath here there's a drawer which the dust falls into. I've actually done a similar thing on my mitre saw, as you can see over here. That's something I'll probably explore in future anyway, but that depends on whether I decide to keep this saw or upgrade. That's it for this one. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos. You can also support the channel on Patreon if you want to. There's a link to that in the description box below too. And over on Patreon you can get early access to my videos, some exclusive content, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos. Thank you for watching.